Hello and welcome. We'll be started in just a moment here. We're going to give it another minute or so for some people to join us. All right, wonderful. Well, I'm going to hop into it then. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us in what is now a post-summit session. I think if a lot of you joined us last week, you might have joined the large commercial meetup, which we really treated more like a lecture session. And I'm really excited today to just be with our usual Better Buildings CRE family so that we can do a lot more of making those connections and having conversations that I know we've missed since we've been in person. So you are in the right place if you are here for the commercial real estate meetup. Go to the next slide. I want to go over just a couple of housekeeping items before we dive in. The first is that we are going to be recording today's session and posting it to the Solution Center. However, it's a little bit unique because we're only going to be recording and posting the portion of this webinar that includes all of our programmatic updates and our speakers. When we actually get to our happy half hour at the end of this, that will not be recorded or posted. So I hope that you all feel free to open up and chat with your colleagues during that time, knowing that we're not going to post it on the internet. Additionally, if you've joined, you might have noticed that you have the option to unmute yourself or share your own video. We really hope that you'll take the opportunity to do that and ask questions and get involved in the conversation. But we all know the rules by now. If you are not speaking, please do keep yourself on mute to minimize that background noise. Also, if you do have any audio or visual issues or other technology issues, we would love to help. And so you can use the Zoom chat function and drop down from there and let us know what's going on, and we can help you through the Zoom chat. And finally, at the end of this, we are going to be using Zoom breakout rooms. So I'll give some more directions at that time, but pay attention because you might need to click on something to continue the conversation. Wonderful. So what we're going to be doing today, you go to the next slide, is that we're going to spend just a little bit of time doing some program updates, and then we are joined by some wonderful speakers and guests. They're going to talk a little bit about what's been going on in CRE and what we can look forward to in the next year as well. So that'll go through carbon goals, some partner updates. We'll hear from ULI and Real Estate Roundtable. Then we'll have a big old group discussion about ideas for better buildings and general discussion before we go into our happy half hour, which will be in Zoom breakout rooms. So with that, I can move on to introducing some of the people we have on the line today. I think everybody should know me, but my name is Hannah Debelius, and I'm with the Building Technologies Office. And I have the wonderful privilege of working with the commercial real estate sector for Better Buildings. And I am joined by a couple of my colleagues here. So Deb, why don't we start with you?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see so many of our friends on the line today. We're really looking forward to our annual CRE meetup. So again, I'm Deb Cloutier. I'm the president and founder of RETech Advisors and one of the subject matter experts on commercial real estate, and just really happy to be here. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Deb. Excellent. Andrea.
Hey everyone, I'm Andrea Dukakis. I think I know basically everyone on the line. I am the account manager for commercial real estate as well as healthcare and market rate multifamily. And I work on the waste pilot and a few other tasks with Hannah related to Better Buildings.
Excellent. And Allie.
Hi everyone, I also think I know everybody on the line. I'm the junior account manager for commercial real estate as well as healthcare, soon to be hospitality. And I also do work on the Better Buildings workforce programs as well as webinars.
Excellent. Thanks, Allie. So we're going to move on and just share a couple of, actually, before we do that, I'm going to introduce Slido, which is that if you were with us last week for Summit, this should be familiar to you, but if not, we're going to be using Slido today for, particularly for some polls. So the best way to do it is if right now you can either open up your mobile device or open up an additional browser window and go to slido.com and then put in the event code CRE. And if you open up and do it right now, that'll allow you to participate in our polls and chat with us. I think it'll be a really big help so that we can stay engaged and actually, discuss with one another and see where you're all at. So I'll give you a moment to do that now. And you're gonna wanna leave that up for the whole session. All right, and now with that, I actually will be going into some program updates. So next slide, please. You can go one more. First, welcome to our new partner this year. Empire State Realty Trust joined us, and it's been a pretty epic year for them as well. I know they've made some wonderful announcements around renewable energy this year, and hopefully you all were able to catch Dana Schneider also sharing in Summit last week. But if not, all of our sessions from last week will be available in the Better Building Solutions Center. Next slide. I'd also like to thank Iron Mountain Data Center because we did a virtual site visit with them, and they were wonderfully able to accommodate that as we moved to the virtual format this year. And although I would have loved to go in person to an underground data center in a cave, the pictures really were fabulous, and they were able to reprise that tour as well during the Better Building Summit. This year, we also, of course, continued with the Green Lease Leaders program. I see a lot of you are Green Lease Leaders who joined us today, and so you are probably familiar that this is a program that we run in partnership with IMT that recognizes organizations who pursue green leases, in particular with the effort to address the split incentive. And this year, we saw really just wonderful turnout and gains for Green Lease Leaders. The next slide. We were able to recognize 43 organizations last week, which is awesome. Yeah, I actually saw a couple of surprised faces there on the video, so I'm glad to see it. Yeah, it was really wonderful. And we, this year alone, there was the total amount of space impacted equal to all the other years put together. So it's a really big jump, and we're so glad to see this in the industry, and I can't wait to see where we can take this program and green leases from here. We also had more than half of our applications be from new Green Lease Leaders, and a lot of growth in organizations outside the United States. So really cool stuff there, and I hope, congratulations to all of our Green Lease Leaders, and I can't wait to hopefully continue this next year. We also have a lot of things that went out in the Better Building Solutions Center. So I'm not going to read through all this, but the slides will be available to you. And hopefully a lot of you also recognize your names up there. Even though it was a tough year all around, we saw really creative and wonderful solutions from our CRE partners. So thank you all for everyone who's worked with us to get solutions up. And if you are just really riding the Better Buildings train and cannot wait for more webinars this summer, we have a webinar series that'll start next week. Just to highlight two that might be of interest, next week, yes, we'll have electrifying your buildings, because we know electrification has come up a lot, particularly recently. I've been hearing about it. You can join for that. And also on July 20th, we'll have workforce evolution, which is supporting occupant health while achieving energy efficiency. And a couple of CRE partners will be joining us for that as well. You can go to our next slide, please. So with that, I also I want to say thank you to a couple of our presenters and partners that are joining us today. Hannah Kramer and Joe Indivik are going to be joining me talking about the carbon pilot and carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. Andrew Wright and Marta Scamps are going to be talking about some ULI survey results about COVID. And Dwayne from Real Estate Roundtable is going to be sharing some policy updates. So a lot of good stuff coming our way. So with that, I think actually we'll move into our first conversation here, which is about carbon goals and greenhouse gas emissions. So you go to the next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about the low carbon pilot. We have a wonderful number of CRE partners on board for this. And again, partners who have joined the low carbon pilot are, over the next 2 years, going to work with us directly to showcase real world pathways to low or no carbon in two existing buildings. And they'll be working with our wonderful technical assistance team, and really one in particular technical assistance expert, which is Hannah Kramer. So Hannah, could you just pop on and introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Hannah Kramer with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and I'm the technical assistance lead for commercial real estate for the low carbon pilot. We've just started to get some of those plans in, and it's really great to look at the plans and get to know what your issues are. And it's my job to look into the research and the kind of state of practice for certain things that maybe you're having a challenge with. So I'm excited to be able to help commercial real estate and go down that low carbon pathway.
Thanks. We can go to the next slide. We have over 50 partners joined across Better Buildings, and about half of those are somewhere on the commercial side. But it's not, if you'd like to join us, it is not too late. We're going to be accepting new partners into this effort until June 15th. So you can reach out to myself or Andrea or Ali, and we will kick it off with a conversation. And with that, I think I will turn it over to Joe.
Hey everybody, good to be with you. I see some familiar faces as well. So wanted to take a minute to talk about some of the recent trends that we're seeing in carbon target setting in the commercial real estate space. There's definitely a pretty, as I'm sure we have all noticed, a pretty significant zeitgeist happening in the world, which is A, an opportunity for me to use the word zeitgeist, and B, I think a big opportunity to show leadership on carbon reduction. One way to kind of think about that is looking at the Fortune 500 companies. This is a great study that National Capital Partners compiles every year about how many of the Fortune 500s have set carbon targets. And these are only the most aggressive carbon targets. So this is showing science-based targets, or SBTs, RE100, which is a renewable energy commitment, and or carbon neutral or net zero commitments. And if you attended the session on low carbon targets at the summit, this will look familiar to you. But as of 2015, only about 3% of Fortune 500 companies had a target, and now it's about 30%. So we've seen essentially a 5x increase in just a few years. And while that trend isn't perhaps quite so pronounced in the commercial real estate industry, I think it's pretty darn close based on all the new announcements that are coming out, particularly around Earth Day announcements a few weeks ago. So you're getting to the point now where in order to be sort of competitive on the ESG front, I personally feel, and I think a lot of investors feel, that carbon needs to be part of the ESG story that you're telling. If you go to the next slide, that's also kind of evidenced by the rising number of frameworks that are out there for companies to report on and disclose and get credit for their carbon reduction activities. So there's a lot of frameworks flying around. A lot of times the first question we get is sort of, how is this relevant to CRE? How many actual real estate organizations are participating in each of these? So we did a little research and put it on this slide here. So science-based targets, large number of companies, hundreds, I think perhaps over 1,000 companies now participating, 72 of which are in real estate. So fair representation from real estate, not a huge amount. I was particularly surprised by Carbon Disclosure Project, or formerly known as Carbon Disclosure Project, now at CDP, with over 400 real estate organizations participating, 300 in RE100, which is the renewable energy target I mentioned, 72 in the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And there's a few others, a couple that we didn't pull data for, but the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, which is not to be confused with the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, which are different things. But the latter has 87 signatories, many of which are in the real estate or real asset space. And then MARTA will be happy that I note the ULI Greenprint Net Zero 2050 commitment recently announced as well. So there's lots of action happening in this space, including in commercial real estate. And I'm excited to have a discussion about kind of what some of the folks on the line are seeing and thinking about in terms of how they're setting targets, because the challenge really here isn't not the what, but the how. It's easy to set a target. It's hard to achieve and define that target precisely. So I'd love to get into a conversation about that.
Awesome. So I think actually to kick off a conversation like that, we're going to use some Slido polls just to see where everyone's at with this. So again, if you go to slido.com, put in the event code CRE, and I think we can go ahead and launch I like these comments so far. Anonymous is very excited. But I think we go ahead and launch our first poll, which is, we know, as just mentioned, that a lot of people are already tracking greenhouse gas emissions and carbon. So do you include tenant emissions in your greenhouse gas emissions accounting and reduction plans? Some tenant emissions coming on the top, which is not surprising. I know that for the low carbon pilot, I've spoken to a lot of people about which buildings they might want to choose to pursue low carbon pathways, and the issue around tenants and lease and tenant data is definitely at the top.
Well, just by these numbers, you guys are already ahead of what's sort of typical or average in the market, I would say, because I'd say the majority of CRE inventories don't include any tenant emissions. So this is really good. This is good stuff.
Of course, they're better than the average, Joe.
Now that I'm
they're
surprised.
better building partners. All right, I think that we'll move to the next poll then, which is on the same theme, which is when accounting for reducing tenant emissions, what are the main challenges? And this is just open-ended. So we'd love to hear more about this. And if someone would like to expand on what they put in here, you also are welcome to either, if you can either chat me in Zoom and I'm happy to call on you, or you can unmute yourself. Yeah, getting data access, getting data, yes, collecting the data. And sub-meters, that makes sense. Yes, quite the theme here. Education, that's interesting. If you put in education, I'm curious to know if you mean like education for your tenants or facility staff, or if you could expand on that, or you're welcome to drop that in the Zoom chat and I can read it there. Yeah, it's a lot of operational control and data. Okay.
Yeah, I'd love to chat when we get to the discussion about kind of how people are getting around the tenant data problem, other than just asking for it more nicely or more firmly, with looking at technology solutions or other metering solutions.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Okay, we can go to our next poll, I think, which are what categories of emissions are you currently measuring outside of direct emissions and purchased energy? So in essence, which, if any, scope 3 emissions are you tracking?
So that's not necessarily like waste diverted. That's just straight up emissions from waste. Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like scope 3 landfill emissions, basically.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. So a lot of people seem to be tracking work-related travel and employee commuting, which is interesting. From when I was in the higher ed sector, we also tracked those through an annual survey to employees and also students since I was in higher ed. But I'm curious how people are getting the data about employee commuting as well. And for that matter, work-related travel, since it's so much harder to, you think it'd all be in one place, but as we all know, it's, there's corporate cards and personal, credit cards paying for this and that, and it's harder to track travel. I'm also seeing some Zoom chats about this. Ethan said the refrigerants are modeled by the customer, and there's no option for none. That's true. We're wondering for those that are tracking. And lead transportation surveys, of course, that's a great suggestion, Jessica, and makes sense, and consultants. All right, thanks. So a related question to this, and maybe Marta, this is your time to shine, but if you aren't already, what category of emissions are you considering measuring?
Hannah called me out because I'm the one who said there was no option to click none.
Yep. Embodied carbon. So one question I have then for you all is with embodied carbon, so you are considering, tracking this or measuring it. What are your considerations there? Is anyone looking into this and wants to just, pop on and share a little bit about what they're thinking or where they're accessing information on this, or if you're looking for something in particular? Okay.
Another question I might
Yeah.
add to that is, are you interested in evaluating embodied carbon to design new developments differently, or are you interested in it to understand what's currently constructed in your portfolio and measuring that, or both?
I think in most cases, or we're aware that embodied carbon would be the, especially of the options listed here, the biggest scale, right? Embodied carbon of new development. And so that's why it's, I think, at least for us, that's why we would be selecting this option of it's something we're considering, because we would be aware that that's the next largest component for us, and would be using the tools. I think it's great to see a lot of folks in the chat have thrown out EC3, because I think that tends to be where we would be starting.
Yeah, for sure. We do have a couple people in the chat noting EC3, and both for new construction and TI. All right. Well, if anyone tuned into our opening plenary and heard from Maria Vargas also talking about carbon, who's the director of Better Buildings, it's also no surprise that Better Buildings is, in addition to the low carbon pilot, exploring more in the carbon and emissions space. And really over this summer, we're going to be continuing to talk to partners and take a look at the industry and see what's needed and what is the best role for us to play, and looking at carbon commitments also at the portfolio level. So our last question is also directed towards emissions at the portfolio level, which is, what is the greatest barrier to lowering emissions at the portfolio level? And this can be you can share a barrier that's internal, like getting buy-in. It could be cost. It could be that you just need a certain kind of technology that doesn't exist or is cost prohibitive. Whatever you consider to be the greatest barrier here, we're interested in. Yeah, staff capacity. I know, since I speak with all of you basically one-on-one, that everyone wears a lot of hats. So it's time, and cost and technology. Well, I will say that it, before we go into breakouts, towards the end of the session, Deb and I are going to be leading a discussion a bit about what you also are looking for from Better Buildings and DOE, particularly over the next year. So I hope that, especially for everyone who's putting in something technical or technology, we're certainly all ears for that. Staff and leadership buy-in, timing, yeah, and a lot of staff bandwidth. All right, excellent. Well, looking at the clock here, I think I'm going to turn it over to our next section for discussion here, which is that we have Andrew and Marta will be sharing a little bit more about the ULI COVID-19 survey results. So with that, I will turn it over to Andrew.
And I will actually let Marta go first
right.
to introduce things. Sorry.
Perfect. So hi, everyone. ULI launched a survey this spring, specifically of our members who are owners and developers and operators of commercial buildings globally, to understand the impact of COVID-19 on building operations, building financial performance, and some social issues as well. Like what and when and why did they adopt building level changes? What challenges did they face or didn't they face? And what's the longevity of those changes? And we tried to keep it pretty tight toward the building and the systems and the activities within the building. And we brought in RETEC to implement the survey. So I don't want to steal the thunder. Andrew, please just take it away in terms of the survey and its analysis of results.
Thanks, Marta. That's a really great intro. So as you can see on the slides here, the survey was open for a few weeks in April this year. So just about a month ago, we closed it up, and we had, I would say, a pretty broad spectrum, a pretty diverse response overall. We had 300 respondents throughout the US with operations in various regions across various real estate industry roles as well. You'll note that the percentages add up to over 100. That's because people were allowed to select multiple regions if they had operations in multiple areas. You may see that on other slides throughout as well. So I just want to note that. Next slide, please, Allie. So as Marta alluded to, we were trying to focus on what actions were actually taken at the property, and we focused on sort of three primary categories. So equipment and operational changes, which is just what it sounds like, but actual changes to HVAC and the way it's being used. So the stuff you see there is like filtration, airflow changes, things like that. Then we had space layout, which is really changes to like treatment and use of the building. So that's a lot of like cleaning, touchless technologies, barriers, spacing, and things like that. And then occupancy is about how people are entering and using the space. So masking their entry and movement through the space. Next slide. So what we found, and I will note also, this is a very quick snapshot. We are still doing some analysis. So if there's specific things that you're interested in learning about, let Marta or myself know, and we can think about digging back into that. But so on the property actions at a high level, we asked about all of those measures that were listed on the prior slide and found that on average, those who implemented measures implemented a few of each. So 6 out of the 9 space layout measures, 5 of the 7 occupancy control measures, and 3 out of 10 equipment measures. That one was slightly surprising. I think we thought we'd see more actual changes in the operations and stuff like that. But the flip side of that is I'm certainly not surprised to see the occupancy changes and space layout changes. That's all the basic social distancing, masking type stuff that I think we've all grown quite accustomed to over the last year or so. And again, occupancy and space layout really is, I think, where all of us experienced that throughout the last year. And that's probably some of the easiest stuff to get through, more likely to hit a short-term operational budget rather than a long-term capital budget investment, things like that. So if we go to the next slide. So in terms of barriers, we asked people, generally speaking, did you face barriers when trying to implement these changes? And for the most part, folks said no. About half of respondents disagreed and said they didn't face barriers. About a quarter were neutral. Only 23% agreed that they face barriers, specifically lack of funding, lack of internal support or buy-in, or lack of guidance. There were a few others mentioned as well in terms of lack of availability of products at points, lack of evidence that measures would be effective, some physical and logistical constraints, right? If you don't have the space to do social distancing or something like that, or install a barrier, that can obviously get in the way. And then actually a couple folks also mentioned pushback from tenants, but again, those were in the minority overall. I think what we, again, most of us experienced over the last year was that urgency necessitated action and reduced the barriers to change at the property level. Next slide. If we look at the motivations, again, this is what we were told by folks who responded. But for the most part, people reacted to third-party guidance and shared experiences from peers. Certainly guidance from the CDC and other organizations like ASHRAE was noticed to be especially critical. Certainly local government guidance or regulations necessitates action. Company mission was a top 5 motivator in terms of maintaining adherence to your mission and meeting your stakeholders' demands. And along with that, liability to staff, tenants, and other stakeholders. And then reputation in the market was another one. Those are the top 5. There were a few others mixed in there as well. I think one of the key things here really was the peer experience, especially it sounds like through Greenprint meetings. It seems like a lot of those, I imagine also the Better Buildings conversations as well, but folks were comparing their due diligence that they were doing on their own to research and anecdotes that they saw from other firms, and just trying to figure it out together. It seems like that was kind of a nice silver lining to all this, is people working together to figure out all these problems and help each other out over the last year. Next slide. So one thing I didn't mention on motivations was IAQ and healthy building certifications. We thought that this would have been a bit more of a driver in terms of getting that third-party accreditation for your efforts to prove that your building was in fact healthy and meeting the needs, and giving that signal to tenants and stakeholders. But that wasn't the case. WELL was the most likely certification to be pursued. LEED is the most prevalent already. But in general, there wasn't a lot of interest in pursuing certification. Next slide. And so in terms of Permanency, we asked folks, again, how long they thought that this stuff would be in place, these measures would be in place. No surprise here, permanently for equipment measures, right? If you've made a capital improvement, if you've changed your HVAC equipment or installed UV lighting, things like that, that's probably going to be there for a while. Whereas the space layout, occupancy control measures, you're not going to ask people to wear masks forever, hopefully. So a lot of those were, you know, until the pandemic is over. But there were also some questions that came out here, you know, a lack of clarity in terms of what the future holds among the survey respondents, asking, you know, will we or our tenants continue to allow teleworking? Will we bounce back, or is this a forever change to our culture and specifically like commercial real estate culture? So those are things that are out there. It seems like there's still a fair bit of uncertainty in how things are going to shake out, which I think makes sense as we're still emerging from it. Next slide. So lastly, the financial impacts in terms of leasing. I mentioned before the concept of we're all in this together. A lot of folks indicated that, you know, you really cannot over communicate. Tenant and landlord communication was critical. Folks made rent concessions, adjustments, lease amendments at the majority of their properties, it seems like. Or at least the majority did it at some properties. Again, I think that's no surprise. Things were totally disrupted last year, and so folks had to find ways to move forward, essentially, together. Next slide. I think I'm done. Yep.
All right, thanks so much, Andrew. And actually, we have, you know, a couple of minutes here. If anyone has any questions for Andrew, I'm just going to put you on spot, Andrew. If anyone have any questions, or
Yeah,
you know,
definitely.
really related to some of the information you saw, you know, you can either unmute and speak up, or if you want to put something in the chat, I can read that out or call on you. I'll give it just a moment for you to think about it.
While you guys are thinking, a couple of the other toggles that we had thought about analyzing, we're looking at by building type. And Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, but there wasn't a big significant difference in between the different building types worth putting on a slide necessarily at a high level.
It
similar
didn't seem to be, yeah.
Geographically as well, we didn't see a huge difference, even though we could slice and dice that way. It wasn't worth sharing anything because it was all similar.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we may do a little more on the geographic side to see if there's any specific differences. But even in, you know, one thing I didn't mention was the survey process. And there's a few folks that helped us out in this call. So thank you to Jonathan and Becca and a few others. You know, we talked to firms with nationwide presences, and some of them said that they took a California conservative approach and went with a more strict set of changes, and others had it mixed throughout their portfolio, where their Texas properties adhered to Texas regulations and the California properties did what they needed to do. And it does seem like it varied sometimes within portfolios, but I also think there was an acknowledgement that if you're going to do this in one part of your portfolio, it's pretty easy to just roll it out to everybody and say, this is the safest standard and we're going to go with that.
I'm curious, it seems like that asked a lot of questions about what did you do? And so it's almost like value neutral. Were there subsequent questions to say what was effective or what was useful? Like it's almost more interesting to say, like there's interesting follow-up there to say, okay, a lot of us did this. Would we do this again, or did we find this effective, or looking back on it, this was not the best use of our time or resources?
A great point, Matt. We did not get into that stuff. We did have open response boxes at the end, so folks could have provided that. I don't think we saw much about that. But you make a great point, is that some of these are going to be a lot more effective. And again, in the interview process, we got varying opinions about, you know, the efficacy of UV lighting, right? And compared to bipolar ionization, and one is a higher labor investment and one is a higher capital investment, right? And so there's differing approaches based on that. Probably, I think, is dependent on building type and business model and things like that. But we did not ask for that qualitative stuff.
right, interesting. That's a great question, Matt. And it seems like Jonathan put in the chat that he also liked your question. Wonderful. Well, at the end of this, if you end up in the same breakout room or happy hour with Martha or Andrew, you can also continue that conversation. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Dwayne from Real Estate Roundtable, who has graciously agreed to give us a bit of a policy update. So Dwayne, you can go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Hannah, and good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I am Dwayne Desiderio. I work for an organization here in town in Washington, D.C., the Real Estate Roundtable. We are an advocacy organization where we work on federal policy on behalf of the real estate industry. And I am RER's staff lead for our Sustainability Policy Advisory Committee, our SPAC. So I see a number of SPAC folks out there in the chat room. Hello to all of you. And some of the items that I'm going to talk briefly about today are probably not news to you because we discuss these quite frequently on our SPAC calls. But Hannah and the team at DOE were gracious enough to provide me a quick opportunity to give a brief update on what's going on in the world of buildings, energy, climate in terms of policy in Washington, D.C. And there is certainly a lot going on in this space right now. As you can see from the slide here, a couple of items I particularly want to hit on. The Biden administration American Jobs Plan. This is the hard infrastructure bill, the physical infrastructure bill that would propose several $1 trillion worth of investment in the nation's infrastructure. An interesting part of this proposal, which at RER, and I know many of you were thrilled to see, is they treat buildings as they should, as infrastructure, both commercial buildings and housing. And right now we are in the process of watching a bunch of bills go through Capitol Hill committees to flesh out some of the goals in the Biden administration's infrastructure plan. So one top line point to keep in mind is the Biden plan sets a goal to build, preserve, and retrofit more than 2 million homes and commercial buildings in the United States. We were thrilled to see that. We think it's long overdue that investments are made into energy efficient housing, energy efficient buildings. And we're anxious to see how these are moving through Capitol Hill right now as some of the key committees in Congress start fleshing out some of these proposals that are in the Biden administration's jobs plan. And I think front and center, we couldn't be having a more timely discussion because one of the main goals to provide more assistance to energy efficient homes and buildings is through the tax code and to focus on energy efficiency tax incentives that would be geared toward new construction and toward retrofits. On the Senate Finance Committee, just as we are speaking, there is a markup going on of Chairman Wyden. Chairman Wyden Ron Wyden from Oregon is the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee that has the Senate's jurisdiction over tax issues. Mm-hmm. They're holding a markup today on a massive clean energy tax package that focuses not simply on clean energy creation, carbon sequestration, a whole bunch of climate-friendly technologies, but also includes issues that would boost and increase incentives to encourage more energy efficiency in commercial and residential buildings. One of the main issues that RER has been focused on here is to ensure that the tax code, or at least moves the tax code in a direction that encourages more retrofits of existing buildings. So right now, I think a number of you are probably familiar with the current tax code incentive, section 179D of the code. It's been around the code since 2005. And the intent when Congress first passed the incentive was to not simply encourage new construction to become more energy efficient, but also to make provide an incentive for existing buildings to be more energy efficient. I think it's fair to say over time that at least with the retrofit angle and making new buildings more efficient, the 179D incentive has not lived up to its potential. So RER, we've spent a number of years suggesting various ways, not simply to reform the 179D incentive, but also to add new provisions to the tax code that would make its tax incentives more geared to retrofits for aging commercial buildings. pleased to report, just got some good news. This would be a significant policy change. We will see if it sticks. Through the markup, Senator Cardin from Maryland offered what we would think is a key change to the 179D tax incentive, where the measurement of improvements for the 179D incentive would be geared not relative to improvements over the ASHRAE 90.1 standard, but it would be measured with regard to improvements over a building's own energy benchmarking using the portfolio manager tool. So just dissecting that a little bit. The current tax code under 179D gives an incentive for a building that improves energy efficiency by 50% over the ASHRAE 90.1 standard from the year 2019. So if you consider a building, say, that was constructed in the year 2000 or earlier, what that would mean is to retrofit that building, it would need to improve its energy performance up to a 2019 level and then go 50% beyond that. What we've learned from our members and having a number of discussions down the years, that is a lofty stretch for a building retrofit project, not simply to come up to a modern code standard, but then to stretch beyond that. So we have long offered a suggestion that changing the baseline for a retrofit incentive that would be more geared toward portfolio manager inputs. So you could be measuring the before and after improvement of a building's own energy consumption would be a truly meaningful incentive to encourage building retrofit projects. So apparently this passed out of the committee. We're thrilled to see it. We still have a long way to go. It still needs to go to the Senate floor. It needs to go through the House. But we're very pleased, at least we seem to be making some market progress here in reshaping the tax code to have a meaningful incentive finally to encourage existing building retrofits. So we're very focused on that as part of the infrastructure package. Another key policy issue that we are focusing on, moving a bit away from the legislative angle, concerns some issues that are going on at the Securities and Exchange Commission. And it gets into some of the earlier slides we were looking at with regard to scope 3 emissions and how a number of real estate companies might be measuring and quantifying that. What's interesting and what we're seeing going on in the climate policy space with the new administration is that it's not simply just the usual suspects, DOE, the Environmental Protection Agency, that are focusing their regulatory efforts on building energy efficiency and climate-related issues. But we're seeing climate as part of a whole of government approach that's also gaining the attention of the federal financial regulatory agencies. So the federal banking agencies, the Fed, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, for example. So right now the SEC has open for public comment, gathering requests from stakeholders, not simply just for real estate, but all stakeholders, on what kind of corporate disclosures of climate risks the SEC might be encouraging or perhaps might even be requiring. So we're right now in the phase where the SEC is gathering public comment on these issues. It's asking questions such as, what kind of third-party standards should the SEC adopt or at least reference? What kind of emissions from various corporate stakeholders might be best quantified and measured? RER, working very closely with NAREIT. A number of you are also NAREIT members. I saw Fulia out there. Hi, Fulia. We've been coordinating on what our comments will be to the SEC to help our companies navigate what we're viewing as the first ever federal guidance or federal regulations, at least in a serious way, that could lead to corporate disclosure of climate-related risks. So I think it's fair to say that our mantra here is, buildings are unique environments. Buildings have different tenant occupancy mixes. They rely on different fuel sources. They're in different climate zones. So while certainly the trend in our industry is for companies to report on climate-related risks in the documents they need to file with the SEC, we want to make sure our companies have broad flexibility in how to do this. There's not a one-size-fits-all climate disclosure standard. That certainly would apply across all industries and certainly not within real estate, given various product types and a number of variables. So that's another thing to keep on folks' radar. Those comments are due to the SEC on June 14th. We're just right now in the request for information stage, but we think the next step out of this will come a proposed rule from the SEC at some point that might lead to some kind of more if not a full-blown regulation standards with teeth that we're going to see from the federal government in that regard. So keep a lookout there with what's going on with regard to the SEC and corporate disclosures on climate risks. And then third, I think another important point to get on folks' radar is, while what we're talking about thus far, at least coming from Congress, the focus has been on spending and incentives to improve buildings and to reduce their GHG emissions. And what we've seen from the financial agencies regulatorily are disclosure of climate-related risks. The real regulatory standards are starting to hit the road at the state and local level, at the city level. So as part of this trend we've seen over the last 10 years or so, where cities, I guess we have 24 at this point, that have required buildings to benchmark and disclose their energy consumption as part of phase 1 of city and local state regulations. We're now starting to see these benchmarking laws morph into building performance standards. Standards on buildings that would propose climate targets, energy reduction standards on buildings that they would need to meet. It's not happening at the federal level. We don't see federal legislation proposed in this regard, but the trend is certainly occurring at the state and local level. For example, many of you who might have New York properties might be familiar with Local Law 97 in New York. So passed the city council back in 2019. It's kind of the marquee law that a lot of folks have been looking to as part of this trend where cities and localities, and in some cases states, might be looking to impose building performance standards on specific assets to reduce their energy emissions and energy consumption and their carbon emissions. Washington, D.C. has a similar law, St. Louis and Washington State. All of these localities are taking different approaches, but in any event, to kind of manage this process, the Institute for Market Transformation has issued a model local ordinance that would be intended to guide states and localities to consider various issues as they're developing their performance standards on buildings. RER submitted a comment letter back over, I guess, a little bit over a month ago that raises some questions and concerns with what IMT proposed. So I would encourage you to check out that link to get a sense of how the SPAC committee, the sustainability committee that directed these comments, gives you a sense of what's on the mind of the energy and performance managers in our real estate companies in some of the obstacles and opportunities they're seeing with these state and local building performance regulations on their assets. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for any questions or comments. But thank you, Hannah, for the opportunity to talk today.
Yeah, absolutely, Dwayne. And I also, Andrea reminded us in the chat that there's also on the reactions button, which is the bottom of Zoom, there's an option to raise your hand. So you can also raise your hand, and then if you have any questions, I can call on you to speak up.
Anna, this is Deb. I had a question maybe for Dwayne, not wearing my anything related to support of the Energy Star program hat, just as a concerned citizen. So wondering, I know we had such a battle a little while ago related to Energy Star portfolio manager funding. I'm wondering, and Real Estate Roundtable and many other organizations within the real estate community were super supportive of trying to help legislators understand both the usefulness, the capability set, the, how much they've started to incorporate that as a standard into their management practices. I was just wondering if you could speak at all to any, like, your perspective on that topic vis-a-vis some of these new initiatives that might actually directly call upon portfolio manager as a potential tool.
Yeah, thank you, Deb. Great question. So I think it's fair to say with the new administration, there are different issues to address than perhaps with the prior administration. And in the early days of the Trump administration, as Deb had indicated, there were some pretty serious budget hits that were proposed to a number of agencies. And at that point in time, I don't recall what the budget cut was, but it might have been to pencil out the Energy Star program entirely. Well, thankfully, we're not at that point in the new administration, but We did put a number of resources and advocacy effort into not simply educating the offices on Capitol Hill that were under Republican control at the time, but also the administration. My chairman, my boss, myself, we met with former Administrator Pruitt to impress upon him the importance of Energy Star as at the federal level as a voluntary tool that is used by 25% of commercial real estate space at this point. We do not have to sell the importance of Energy Star among the folks on this call, but it was an education for some folks. And I think fair to say, we're pretty proud to notch a win that we were able to at least have some role in making sure to preserve Energy Star's portfolio manager tool and educating some of the key policymakers at the time that it's a voluntary incentive program. It is standard practice in the real estate industry. It's not simply just an environmental tool, it's a dollars and cents tool to make sure that buildings are measuring and tracking their energy consumption, their water consumption, and how they might be disposing of waste. And as Deb kind of intimated, we've kind of taken the portfolio manager idea and run with it. Our members on our SPAC have developed a very positive relationship with the Energy Star program, and over time have encouraged modifications to it, such as through the Energy Star for Tenants program. I think we were one of the first organizations to advocate that it be expanded to also allow waste and water tracking. And as I mentioned, in looking at how a tax incentive might be geared to truly encourage building retrofits, we think it would be a really significant policy change and kind of put the tax code for energy efficiency on steroids if we could get more of our members to kind of do a before and after comparison using what their portfolio benchmarking metrics were before a retrofit and what they might be designed to be after a retrofit, and providing a tax deduction based on that, as opposed to having a building that was constructed many years ago come up to a modern standard and then go beyond that. That might be appropriate for new construction, but it doesn't speak to retrofits. And yes, we've completely geared that toward use of the portfolio manager tool. So we'll see if this particular policy that we've been pushing sticks. So fingers crossed.
Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dwayne. Anyone else with a question before we move on? You can raise your hand or type it in the box. We all know how to do Zoom now.
I'll jump in with a quick question. Dwayne, I appreciate that overview. For some of us who are less familiar, you talked about the SEC just being at that RFI stage.
Yeah.
For some of us who are less familiar with that, what does that timeline look like from where it sits today? What has to happen before it starts to impact some those of us with public reporting requirements?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Great question. Putting it this way, so the phase that we're at now is what's known as a request for information, an RFI. And that's basically just what the SEC is doing. It's requesting information. It's issued about 15 major questions with about, all told, maybe about 50 sub-questions on a whole variety of issues related to climate measuring and reporting, corporate governance, with regard to climate-related and ESG disclosures. So it will wrap up this comment process on this request for information. Nothing regulatory, nothing that will bind companies to do anything will come out of this process right now. But what we are gearing for, Matt, is once the SEC does its due diligence, gets information from a whole variety of stakeholders, we're then anticipating it would propose a rule in the Federal Register. And at that point, a proposed rule wouldn't have regulatory compliance obligations either. Once a rule is proposed by the SEC based on the information it's gathering, another public comment process, a more lengthy one, would ensue after that. There'd probably be a 60-day comment period at the proposed rule stage. And then only after that, at some point in time, might we see some kind of SEC formal guidance or regulation come out of that process. So this request for information right now, which is just information gathering, this comment process closes on June 14th. One would think there would be some period of time, a couple of months, where the SEC might digest all of the information it gets from a whole bunch of stakeholders. We know there's high interest across the corporate sector, not simply just for real estate, and responding to what the SEC has proposed here. So maybe before the end of the year, maybe we're anticipating that the SEC will be intent to take this forward. Maybe before the end of the year, we might see a proposed rule that will kick off another comment process where comments will be more geared to the exact rubric that the SEC would have proposed. And then only at some time period after that might a regulation that has requirements on companies be kicked in. So, and I think even this is kind of a pretty quick schedule. So even if things were to move very quickly, I can't imagine we would see a final rule or a final standard coming out of the SEC for at least a year to 18 months from now. Now, of course, I could be completely blown out of the water and they might move with lightning speed on this. This is not something that has to go through Congress. This is within the SEC's own administrative control, but it does have to go through a legal process. It has to go through the public notice and comment process under federal law known as the Administrative Procedure Act. When it gets ready, to get close to a final rule, it has to be approved by the Office of Management and Budget. So the process will take some time to run its course. I think it's fair to say we're maybe at the top of the first inning. We still have a bunch of innings to go before we might see something that would impact the 10Ks and the quarterly reports that a public company might file. But we're on it and we'll see where it goes.
Thanks.
Thank you, Matt.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Dwayne, I really appreciate you joining us and your expertise and sharing. And as Andrea mentioned in the chat, we'll send out these slides tonight so that people who want to click on these links, you'll have access to that. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Hannah.
And I think we will move forward. And for this section, I'm actually going to request if we could stop the slide screen sharing, and we're going to go to Brady Bunch mode, as we have lovingly started referring to it. If you are just seeing me speak right now, and I'm very large on your screen, you also have the option at the top to go to view and click a little thing that looks like the side of a Rubik's Cube. And then you'll be able to see lots of other wonderful smiling faces in addition to my own. And what you will now hopefully lovingly refer to as Brady Bunch mode. So for those of you who aren't as, maybe just joined us in the last couple of years, every year, us, the Better Buildings CRE sector, we set themes or priorities that we, use throughout the year to really drive where we put our efforts, what solutions we try to go after with different partners, or, what we put forward for session ideas for Summit or at our Better Buildings webinar series. And those themes are decided on, entirely based on the feedback from our sector. And prior to this year, that feedback happened at bars or on the Greenbuild Expo floor or, at conferences, or if I run into somebody, at the coffee shop in DC. So, Deb and I would love to just, as much as we can, have a little bit of a conversation around that. So for this, although we have these polls available, I'd love if we could just try having a regular conversation, like humans without automatic polls. And so I'd love to just hear from a couple of people. Before that, I'll mention that the themes for this past year were health and energy efficiency, for I think obvious reasons. I hope you all caught Jonathan Bauer and Sarah Neff just shared a little bit more of that last week. Looking at benchmarking and benchmarking performance standards. So stay tuned for more on that from us this year. And also carbon emissions and resilience. So we did some things around climate risk assessments, and it's no surprise that we're continuing to talk about carbon. So that gives you an idea. But I would love to hear just anyone who wants to share about something big that they're working on. That could be portfolio-wide, it could be a project that's at one specific building. but I would just love to hear something big you're working on or something that is just super top of mind for you. And you are welcome to use that again in the reactions. You can raise your hand, or I can just see you on mute. You can go for it. I see in the chat, Marta put electrification. The number of times that I've said electrification over the last 2 weeks, yes, it is unreal and wonderful. It is definitely top of mind for us. As I mentioned, we're having a vote our buildings webinar on it. But I'm actually curious. Let's dig into this. Electrification. Who is thinking about this? What do you need? What do you want? Yeah, Marta, I'm going to put you on the spot for this. Expand. Electrification.
So looking at electrification, especially when it comes to greening the grid and overall carbon emissions reductions, natural gas just doesn't have a role in the future of the built environment. And so electrification is on that path, not necessarily tomorrow, but definitely within the next 5 or 10 years if we're going to hit our 1.5 degree scenario. And so thinking through the logistics, the business case, the technologies, the implementation, the buy-in, it's a super complex issue. Dealing with the utility grid and the supply demand constraints on the local substation, thinking about electrical vehicle integration and how that plays with electricity, thinking about the social equity implications when we think about environmental justice and those who are left on the gas grid when the more affluent folks get off it and they carry the burden of the transmission and distribution costs. There are so many nuances, like beyond just building retrofits or new construction of all electric that play into the mix. And I'd love more discussions on it.
And does this group think that it would be useful just to even have a primer on what is electrification to be able to communicate with others within their organization? I find that there isn't as broad an understanding of what we mean when we say electrification and why we want to electrify buildings. Like these chickens that work on it all the time, maybe get it. But if you're trying to communicate with a broader audience, would a tool like that, right? Remember, DOE is very, very good at trying to create tools and resources or replicable solutions. And a lot of it is around building awareness. So curious, is it, a primer that might be useful, or might it be what are the most cost effective from a business case perspective, technologies to help with that transition by property type or by building system? These are the kinds of things that we're just trying to understand what would be helpful in the marketplace. I know you all are not shy.
Yeah, this is Jeremy with
Jeremy.
the Columbia Association. For me, I think the electrification aspect, one of the things that I keep tripping over is that it may in fact result in higher EUIs, right? Because if your coefficient of performance has ever dropped below 3, you're starting to use more raw energy from a primary perspective than you were with natural gas, right? So I think there's very real potential for actual energy use intensities to go up, which is contrary to what we've been really driving for the last several decades. So for me, I think it'd be great to see some case studies where the small 50,000 square foot commercial office building running natural gas package units, condensing or on-demand water heaters compared to a building with heat pumps, maybe dual fuel, maybe not, maybe with electric resistance backup and then electric water heaters. And you will likely see that 50,000 square foot building with all electric is using more raw energy. So I just think we have to look really careful at what that means in terms of, countervailing priorities and a lack of information of how do I get my brain around what this means.
And I think the national labs can help us in that regard, right? With some of the more technology specific conversions or implications. So that's great. How about anyone else on electrification? Marta unpackaged a whole bunch of topics there. Is there any other vote of support for pieces of that or all of it?
Can you hear me, Deb?
Oh, go ahead, Becca.
Hey, yeah, we're pursuing net zero carbon really driven by electrification at Levi's Plaza, which is one of our larger campuses in our portfolio. We're really frankly, it was an asset manager that really kind of dug in and made the suggestion, which was really great. And it's been a really educational opportunity for everybody from our construction team to even our food and beverage lead. And he's been like nerding out insanely. And I'm kind of like along for the ride with all of these food policy experts and people that are basically running like, it's almost like the national lab for kitchen technology. And so, you know, for us, I think it's really important to be, you know, an engaged supporter, but also providing the feedback, whether it's, you know, whether we think it's valid or not, on kind of what we're hearing in the market as well. And I will say that one of the challenges is getting to that 100% electrification, right? Like it's the fire pits and, you know, those little things that you don't always think of. And I think food and beverage is definitely a challenge. Marta and I were on a panel where one of the questions was about like how you're going to pry gas stoves out of chefs' cold, dead hands. And I thought that was funny, but yeah, I mean, it's coming whether we like it or not. And so I prefer to be ready for it.
Yeah. I think I also saw, Dave, that you raised your hand, but I wasn't sure if it was on electrification or something just before that. Dave Crum. And now I think I'm, okay. Maybe he had to pop off because now I can't search the Brady Bunch boxes fast enough on that.
Yeah, anybody else on the topic of electrification? Not that it has to be all voted on right here, right now. So this is also a topic that, you know, we're looking for feedback over, you know, the coming weeks, if you will. But as I like to say, DOE is spending resources developing materials. So why not have them develop the things that you need in your portfolios? So showing up and being part of the conversation gets you a lot further in getting those. So how about other topics? Yeah, Jason.
I'll comment. I think, I mean, the resources idea is big. Primer, you know, an overview of the concept. I think we, you know, see this electrification component as a cost of doing business or transition risk. Not necessarily a bad thing, but I think the big unknown for us as we think about it is just grid reliability and what are some of the business continuity concerns as things go forward in those costs. So if we're looking at, you know, capital planning or we're looking at development, like I think you can plan on these things, but some of those other reliability concerns, I think, are daunting, especially when you see things like, you know, fires shutting down whole markets and grids or other things, or a abnormally cold freeze in Texas or whatever it is, right? So anyway, I agree. I like the primer idea, but I think there's going to, my group would, you know, they're having questions around it about some of these second derivative concerns, aside from just the physical asset.
Yeah, maybe even like a thought leadership piece on some of the implications or the potential pitfalls of not transitioning or that transition risk. Anyone else on this? Were you trying to say something, Andrea?
Yeah, we have two people with their hands raised. So Julia, maybe we start with you and then we'll go to Dwayne after that.
So when we talk about electrification, I know that, and I'm hearing on this call that different parties have different questions and concerns. And for those that are implementing this, like the people on this call, cost is a very important component of it. And although we are ESG experts, not all of us are construction and scoping experts. And coming from the construction side of things, having a nice list of scope for what it takes to do this, I think will be a good starting point, because there are multiple aspects of it that is very easy to miss, from possibly temporary power to hiring consultants to actual construction. So I think it would be a good thing if there was a study where it shows a sample case and what kind of costs are considered, a scope list, almost like a checklist. Then I think it will give a more practical understanding of what it truly takes, because I'm worried that it's all interesting and exciting, but until you do one, you wouldn't know what exactly it's going to cost you. And I think cost is a huge challenge here.
Yeah, the more that we have some sample case studies from our Better Buildings Challenge and Better Buildings Alliance participants, that's certainly something that is right in the wheelhouse of BOE to create. Because as we know, all these buildings are special snowflakes. So there's variability from one modernization project to another. Other hands that are up?
I think Dwayne maybe next, and then looks like Matt after that.
Yeah, just to echo what Fulia said, what Jason said, what we hear from SPAC members, right, is them looking into the cost, the payback, the availability of heat pumps, the availability of technologies, you know, how you'd perform this in a building that's existing with tenants in it relative to new construction. A lot of questions are at play. There had been talk, you know, and it kind of arose at last week's Better Building Summit and in some of the conversations we've been having with the White House of a roundtable on this, a roundtable discussion on electrification. Sign up the roundtable SPAC. I know that we have a bunch of folks that would be more than happy to participate in that discussion to, you know, not simply discuss the challenges, and the challenges are high, but the opportunities as well. But I know a lot of our members are looking into this. You know, they're running pro formas, they're running costs, and the challenges and the concern is very high about this. So we'd love to be part of a, you know, more, if there is a roundtable discussion. I don't think that you'd have much of a problem getting folks from the private sector that would want to share, you know, their research and their data.
Yeah, DOE has a long history of convening groups, as you know, in a variety of different levels, and certainly a point in time discussion all the way up the continuum to an accelerator where there's like a really concentrated group of individuals that are committed to some specified objectives and timeframes of when that's going to happen. So we can explore these concepts. It's always good to have interest drives these more than anything. So, and then Matt, were you trying to jump in on the conversation?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think the types of resources and an internal focus primer would be valuable for the reasons folks have talked about so far, but I would add an external primer for real estate operators to use in conversations we're getting pinged regularly right now to participate in discussions with our state and local policymakers on this. This may not be a role for Better Buildings to play, but there are many others entities on this call who might be able to help us sort of from that policy crafting and political aspect that we've just in the last 30 days had been requested to participate in focus groups and other feedback sessions with the city with the District of Columbia, with the state of Maryland, with others who are trying to get their hands around this. And we at times feel a little, it's a challenging conversation, and having sort of some resources available of sort of general CRE talking points and resources there to back us up when we're having those conversations to craft those policies in the right way would be very helpful.
That's a really good point, and I do think there's a hybrid approach on that one with our friends in some of the trade associations that are well positioned to create those talking points or help in crafting them. Anyone else? Marta, are you seeing hands up from anyone else on electrification? Otherwise, maybe we can jump to other topics that folks see.
Yeah, I'd love to hear some other topics. I am keeping an eye on the chat. If you put a suggestion in there, I've got it in. Marta, I'm not sure about your question on the net zero carbon definition, so I can follow up with you on that. But no, I think it'd be great with the time we have to just hear from a couple of people about other topics.
I can add real quick as well, Hannah. If anyone does not get a chance to speak up or share their opinions today or during this call, we did launch a survey in Slido that has a few questions asking what kinds of things you're working on, what barriers are you hitting, and those sorts of things. So that'll be open until midnight tonight. So you can take that time to, mull it over a little bit this afternoon and plop some ideas in there for us to review later.
Any resources and tools around specific technologies or possibly more information on the health and wellness front? I'm pulling from things that we talked about earlier today, climate risk assessments.
I see Jeremy's hand is raised as well.
Jeremy, come on in.
Thanks very much. So one thing, following up on the COVID presentation earlier, I'm expecting a lot of the operational changes that we implemented throughout our portfolio are going to continue for the foreseeable future. And one of the major ones we made was basically disabling all of our demand control ventilation and putting our outdoor air dampers fixed at 20%, for example. So that's going to have a tremendous long-term impact on our energy use as an organization. All the money I spent on these demand control ventilation systems and CO2 monitors in my spaces, they're all essentially disabled and will be for the foreseeable future. So, when it's 90 degrees here, I'm having 20%, outside air pulled in with 90% humidity, when a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, that damper was closed. And I'm sort of curious about sort of what the group or what the program is thinking around how this is going to impact continuing tracking of energy use performance.
New baselines, right? I mean, yeah.
Right. I don't know. What's the answer?
I don't know if DOE has a position on that, but certainly could help in. Hannah's like, yeah, no, we're not going to comment on that. But I think there is an opportunity for operators to discuss those challenges, and if there are other ways in which they're finding opportunities to kind of counteract that increased usage. So again, maybe like almost a users group discussion around that could be a possibility, and other sort of. I mean, I think the reason why we didn't include so much about the hospitality sector's data in this year's progress report is we're pretty sure that it was an anomalous year of 2020. So everybody is going to have to be contending with this in all of your, it's going to be really interesting to see GRES results for the different property types. Did we really use more or less energy, right? Just because we had a lot of changes in our building usage or adaptive reuse that's underway. So any other, we don't have to beat this to death. You guys can come in with more answers later or ideas, asks for ways to help shape the program. And I like, Andrea, thank you for opening those polls up and leaving them open for a while. And folks can also just always reach out to the ever available team of Better Buildings folks here.
Yeah,
Jim, you got no asks for us, Jim Landau. I'm gonna just call on somebody because it's fun in the afternoon. No, like, oh gosh, I wish DOE would do more of this for us in the CRE section.
Yeah, Deb, the only thing that comes to mind right now is, in MetLife Real Estate, we have an innovation in real estate committee. We partner with Fifth Wall and just internally, we've got associates that are constantly demoing and piloting projects and we keep an inventory of them. I saw one fascinating bit this morning on the monthly call. Just the name of the product escapes me, but it's a 3M product it's a roofing material. It's like pebbles, and it actually, working with sun and rain, it actually pulls carbon naturally, out of the air. And it's a product that you would use instead of, whatever your typical roofing materials, gravel. There's probably a lot. I'm sure there's dozens, if not hundreds, of products that are being developed, and it's going to explode over the next, dozen years or so, certainly the next few years. It'd be great to have like a catalog or an inventory of some of these ideas.
Yeah, no, that's,
Indeed, we may already have
yeah.
it, probably not.
Well, the national labs, Hannah, I don't know if you want to speak to this, but I mean, there's folks that literally spend all day trying to evaluate new building materials, new science development of, you know, I don't know, Hannah, if you want to jump in on that.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean.
Oh, I was.
Yeah.
Which Hannah?
No, two Hannahs. No, Hannah Kramer, please take it away.
So there's two things I was just going to mention with that. There's technology evaluation work that the national labs do consistently every year in looking at kind of like the claims of different new technologies out there. You do a really rigorous monitoring and verification process, and then there's a report that comes out after. That's GSA and DOE's Green Proving Grounds. So there's lots of technologies that go through that, and there's open information that comes out of that process. And the other thing we're doing right now related to low, no carbon is putting together pathways for each building type. So right now, I'm working on large office and small office, and we have pathways for technologies in lighting, HVAC, plug loads, controls, renewables and energy storage and integration, and envelope. And it'll be like, we're getting this down, but simple, medium, advanced, what you can do. Advanced likely will be full electrification. But it gives you a place to start with. And we're using these in the low carbon pilot to kind of talk through with folks, you know, where do you see you're at in this progression? And here's some ideas for how to get started versus like looking at the whole universe of all the vendors out there for every technology is just way too hard. And the national labs really are trying to clarify resources that relate to these pathways and really help Better Buildings partners kind of reduce some of that kind of groundwork in that area.
Yeah, and so it might be good to, how can folks get tapped into the Green Proving Ground, like for readouts or to follow along and as materials are released?
Well, I'm sure we can send out the right links to this group from this call. I don't have off the top of my head, but.
Yeah, no, okay, sorry.
And certainly the pathways document that you mentioned, that's something that we will make a very big effort through Better Buildings to get out to you all. And we've also coordinated those with our technical assistance through the low carbon pilot. So particularly for those of you that are already involved in that, but we'll also be rolling all of that out. I think, you know, we have about, you know, I guess it's about 10 minutes here. And I think I was debating it because I love the Brady Bunch style, but I think I actually might go ahead and put us into breakout rooms because we'd love to hear from those of you that maybe aren't able to speak up in such a big group. So I think that if we can do that, and you are welcome to, you know, the breakout rooms are based on topic, but whatever you end up talking about there is really okay with us. So I think that if we could go ahead and bring that up, you have your option to join for the end of this between 4, and they are not what's in front of me. So I think they are electrification, carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, sensors and controls, and another one that I'm hoping Andrea will come up with in a moment here. But you can go to the bottom and join a breakout room. So if you don't make it back to the main room after that, thank you so much. It is wonderful, wonderful to hear from you. And particularly if you didn't speak up, I also hope that you'll fill out that survey that we have open in Slido. It'll be open the rest of the evening, so you can get some feedback.
And if anyone's having any trouble joining a room, just send a message in the chat and me or Ali can help you.